everyone, welcome to my surprise speculation video for the BreyerFest 2026 Gambler's Choice Model Scandi Surprise, where I will talk about my personal thoughts and speculation regarding what mold I think the surprise model will be. All we know about the model so far is that it is priced at $90 with a quantity of 7,800, which is the same as last year. The blog post about the surprise doesn't give any sort of hints or even slight hints as far as I can tell, which is usually the case, but sometimes they throw in a slight hint. General disclaimer as always, I do not actually know what the surprise model is going to be, and I do not work for Breyer. While the surprise model mold usually ends up being somewhere in my top 10 list, I can of course never guarantee that I will guess it right or even be close to guessing it right. This video is just for the fun of guessing and entertainment purposes. Please don't take it too seriously. Most photos in this video come from Breyer, identifyyourbreyer.com or BreyerHorseref.com. How this video is going to be laid out is I will go over the surprise pattern rules, and then I usually show all of the molds with many of the molds eliminated for various reasons, but I'm actually not going to do that this year. Partly to save myself some time working on this video, but also because of the amount of pattern-breaking molds I am considering this year, that it just doesn't feel necessary to do that this time around. If you're curious about any molds that would have maybe normally shown up in that section of the video, or if you just want to know where I think a particular mold might stand in the way of chances to be the surprise, and it is not mentioned anywhere in this video, you are welcome to comment about any specific ones you're wondering about, and I'll be happy to let you know my thoughts about them. So instead of showing eliminated molds this year, I'm going to be talking more in depth about my process on picking molds, including why I am considering so many pattern-breaking molds. After that, I will then show my list of honorable mentions and top 10 list of guesses. And then lastly, at the end of the video, I will talk a little bit about my thoughts on color possibilities and ideas, particularly for the potential decorator model. Oh, and if you haven't already watched it and want to hear my thoughts about all the other BreyerFest models this year, you can find that video in this video's card or the video description. Now for the surprise pattern rules. In effort to save some time in making this video, I have just reused the audio and visuals I did last year for the surprise model patterns, so if you're already very familiar with these patterns and you want to skip this part of the video, you can go to the timestamp that is listed on screen. First up, I'm going to list the patterns or rules that I think are extremely unlikely to ever be broken. The rules that I think will always be true and why. First, the surprise model will never be a mold that's already been a BreyerFest surprise model. That's kind of a given, I feel like. Breyer just has such a huge category of molds to choose from that using the same mold twice would just not really make any sense. Secondly, the surprise mold will probably never be a mold that is a current BreyerFest special run, and probably also not a current BreyerFest limited edition or celebration model. I feel like there is more leeway when it comes to special limited prize models, like the Best Customs Contest prize model and the Open Show prize models. Those I feel like they can maybe get away with doing possibly the same mold for the surprise. The reason we probably won't see a repeat of the same mold for the same BreyerFest is Breyer wants to sell lots of models, and part of doing that is giving a variety of different models and molds that are going to appeal to different people. Using the same mold for two different releases at the same BreyerFest, again, just kind of doesn't really make sense to do. Thirdly, the surprise mold will probably never be a very unpopular mold. This is kind of for the same reason as above, that Breyer wants to sell lots of models. And they make a lot of the surprise models. They make more surprise models than any of the other special runs. If they made it on a very unpopular mold that hardly anyone wants to buy, or that people are going to be really upset about if they already bought it, then that is really just not going to go over well. They are going to want to use something that is at least generally well liked by the hobby to maybe even being very popular. Lastly, number 4, unless hobby opinions drastically change, we can expect the surprise model to be a traditional scale model. Traditional is just one of the most popular scales, and so they're going to want to stick to what is most popular. Now, while that was the list of kind of more hard and fast rules about the surprise model, there are a bunch of other patterns, and these are the ones that I think are up for possibly being broken at one time or another. So the surprise is usually not used as a previous year BreyerFest model. That includes like special run, limited edition or store special, celebration model, and so on. I think this rule has actually even been broken already before with a model. I think it was with the Roxy model that she was the volunteer model for BreyerFest the previous year. I do still highly doubt that they would use the same BreyerFest special run model again, and probably the celebration model, but I feel like limited edition is a little bit more susceptible to being broken. The surprise model usually has a recent but not too recent release on the mold. The time frame of this is usually about 6 months to 2 or 3 years. The mold often does coincide with the BreyerFest theme in some way. It hasn't always been the case, but usually when BreyerFest has a kind of specific theme going on, the mold does reflect that in some way. The surprise model mold has so far always been at least 3 years old, and it has also not been a mold that is over 20 years. So far, 16 has actually been the oldest. I say 20 years because 20 years is the mark of when something becomes vintage. Therefore, I would say they usually don't go with a vintage mold. So far, the surprise model has always been one model and not a set of models. And the surprise model has also never been a very small traditional scale mold. For example, it's never been like a really small pony mold. So far, the smallest mold that has been used has been Flash. The surprise is usually not the same breed or breed type as the surprise from the previous year. The mold is usually a dynamic pose, but not always the case. The surprise mold is also usually a different pose than the mold from the previous year. For example, there's usually not like 2 trotting molds 2 times in a row. Now I will discuss my thought process in regards to picking my mold guesses and ranking them. This is a very unusual year for picking the surprise model. Usually when picking out guesses, I will be able to have at least some molds picked out that just work for being the surprise in every way. Things like their releases and age align with previous patterns, along with being popular molds and fitting with the BreyerFest theme where applicable. They're kind of like the perfect choices for surprise guesses. Even though they aren't always what ends up being the surprise, they end up being molds that have no issues that would prevent them from being chosen. But this time around, there is not a single mold I can think of that is a perfect choice. Every mold I'm looking at has some kind of issue, some kind of drawback, big or small, that puts things into question. Which is why I wanted to take some extra time this year to talk about my overall thought process. A thought I can imagine maybe some of you are thinking is that if there are no perfect mold candidates, does that mean that maybe the surprise model will be a brand new mold that none of us have seen before? Most likely not. While I think it is certainly possible that the surprise model being a brand new mold is something that will maybe happen someday, I believe it is highly unlikely this year. Making new molds is very expensive and time-consuming. I think if Breyer were to spring such a big surprise on everyone, it would be saved for something extra special like a big BreyerFest anniversary, an anniversary for the company as a whole, or maybe some other reason a particular BreyerFest is extra special. With a new mold not being very likely, that just means that whatever the surprise model ends up being will be a pattern breaker in some way or another. Note that when I say that, it could mean breaking the pattern in a softer way, such as being a mold with a breed type that doesn't really fit the overall BreyerFest theme. Although I do have some molds on my list of guesses that are pattern breakers in a much bigger way, which you will find out more about those as I talk about each individual mold. But yeah, it's kind of looking like that in one way or another, the surprise mold is gonna break a pattern, or at least a pattern that I tend to talk about in these videos. However, it is already not unusual for a surprise model to break or diverge from one of the established patterns in some way, especially considering these are all patterns that I and other hobbyists have come up with over the years. We don't know what factors Breyer does or does not take into consideration when picking the surprise model, if they even take any of these factors into consideration at all. Although I imagine they probably take these factors into consideration, of course, because the hobby would likely riot if any of these particular ones were broken. But I wouldn't be surprised if there are many factors from this list that they don't consider at all, that have just ended up being coincidences over the years, or alternatively, they may sometimes purposely pick molds that break the well-known hobby patterns just to keep us on our toes. Even last year's surprise model broke not just one, but two perceived patterns. One being that it was a sport breed, despite the surprise model the previous year also being a sport breed, although it was at least a warm blood, and the surprise Girls Run the World was a thoroughbred, so not like the exact same breed, but just kind of general sporty type models. And then the other pattern it broke was that this mold was also used as a BreyerFest Open Show Glossy Prize model for the same year. So the surprise model this year breaking one of these patterns in some way is kind of inevitable, but it might actually not be all that unusual. So this means that this year, instead of looking for perfect mold candidates, it comes down to wondering about what patterns might be the most likely to be broken. And that is one of the things I ended up really considering when ordering my list of guesses. Basically taking a bet in my mind of what factors I think Breyer is more likely to look over or break versus ones I think they will actively try and not break this year. For example, because they have used two sport-type breed molds for the past 2 years, I think it's going to be unlikely for them to pick another one this year, or at least another warm blood mold that feels similar to last year's. I can imagine that Breyer doesn't want the surprise model to feel too much like the one from the previous year, and that is something they possibly try to keep track of. And note, I keep saying possibly here. I don't actually know the inner workings of Breyer when picking the surprise model. Remember, this is still all just speculation on my part. Despite the fact that there are several sport breed molds out there that could work well for the theme this year in matching Scandinavian breeds, and some of these molds might not actually break any other patterns either, but I'm just personally weighing that factor more heavily in my order of guesses. Some molds I've decided to just rule out entirely because they feel far too similar to last year's surprise. I'm actually going to mention one mold specifically here because I have seen a lot of guesses for him floating around, which is Vallegro. While he would be a fine fit for the theme, I just think he is way too similar to Totalis in my eyes. They are both warm bloods, they're both performing dressage moves, they are sculpted by the same sculptor, and they even both have stands. I would just be really shocked to see such a similar type of mold be used 2 years in a row. Therefore, I'm spoiling my top list of guesses a little here by letting you know that you won't see this mold on the list. But I haven't ruled out sport breed molds entirely, as you will soon see. I now need to address more my thoughts about the BreyerFest theme in relation to the surprise this year. Unlike the past 3 years that have had broader theming, and therefore almost any mold could technically work for the theme, this year's Midsummer Fair is all about Scandinavian countries, which, if looking specifically at Scandinavian horse breeds, there's a much smaller pool of breed types that technically fit the theme. I also want to quickly note that there is a debate about whether or not Finland is a Scandinavian country, but since Breyer is considering it a Scandinavian country, I am counting it and any horse breeds related to it in this video. With the surprise model being named Scandi Surprise, which is short for Scandinavian, it's hard not to feel like they'd pick a mold that could be seen as a Scandinavian breed in one way or another. I know it's very possible the surprise name doesn't have anything to do with the surprise mold, but it seems like at least in some cases there must be at least some coordination at Breyer for it. For example, Surprise Girls Run the World was a thoroughbred mare mold. The rotating draft Surprise was in fact a drafty type mold. So I would be very surprised if those were just happy coincidences and if they weren't at least somewhat planned. But unfortunately for this year, there actually aren't that many molds that can fit Scandinavian breed types so perfectly. The molds that I think do fit it well all have some kind of bigger pattern breaking issue, such as the aforementioned repeating breed type from last year, or some other kind of pattern breaking factor that is even bigger than that. Therefore, I've been wondering if Breyer will perhaps be interpreting some molds to be a Scandinavian breed, even if the breed those molds were originally sculpted to be don't relate to any Scandinavian breeds at all. Alternatively, I've been thinking that perhaps the actual breed type of the model might not really match Scandinavian horse breeds, and instead the mold just goes with the general vibes of Midsummer Fair instead. And you are going to hear me talk about a mold's vibes a lot in this list of guesses. I'm sorry. A lot of my ordering of this list ended up utilizing a lot of just interpreting a mold's vibes to fit the theme. And I know that's very biased and not a very analytical way to approach it, but that's just kind of what ended up happening. With that, though, is also my thought of what I think Breyer specifically might pick in thinking that it fits with the Midsummer Fair vibes as well. I'm not going off of just what I think, I am also trying to imagine what I think Breyer specifically would be picking. So in the end, in trying to decide what molds would end up on my list of guesses and the order of them, my thinking behind it ended up being a combination of these three lines of thinking. Considering what patterns I think are more likely to be broken, considering what molds could be interpreted to fit the Scandinavian theme, and what molds just have a general vibe that they feel like they could fit into a midsummer festival. Am I overthinking a lot of the things I end up talking about in these videos? And am I overthinking about how Breyer might pick the surprise model mold? Surely I am, but isn't that part of the whole point of these videos? To overthink and overanalyze this fun little aspect of the hobby. Alright, that's enough rambling about my thought process, and it's now time for me to now ramble on about my specific mold guesses. Starting off with the honorable mentions. I was originally thinking I was going to do 5 honorable mentions this year, but I have instead ended up with 4, which is probably for the best, as I try not to do too many honorable mentions. There are a bunch of molds that could have almost made the honorable mention list, but at the end when it came down to it, these were the ones that ended up standing out the most for me compared to the others I have on my overall general list of possibilities. And these are roughly in order, by the way, to what I think is least to most likely. So here is the first honorable mention. Wixom. This mold would work quite well for the Scandinavian theme, since there are several Scandinavian draft breeds. This one in particular might kind of work for her. It's called the Schwelschwig Cold Blood. That's probably not how you say it, but I tried at least. Since she's such a big draft breed, I feel like that could be very fitting for the theme. But unfortunately, there are 3 big problems with her, which is why she is so far down the list here. First off is that she hasn't had a non-one-of-a-kind release since 2021. That's 5 years ago now, which is extremely unusual to see a surprise model mold not being used within 1 or 2 years. Secondly, she is now 25 years old, which is the oldest mold I have on this list, actually. And lastly, I think her popularity might be a little too questionable. I think she is still generally well liked in the hobby, but maybe not popular enough in the sense that a lot of people are going to want to buy a bunch of surprise models of her. I know she absolutely has her fans, but just as a general sense, I don't know. I feel like her popularity is just not as much now compared to other new draft molds that have come out in the past decade or so. So those are all some pretty big factors against her, and I honestly probably wouldn't have included her in this video at all if it wasn't for the fact that she does feel very fitting for the theme. On to the second honorable mention, Goffert. I feel like I've had this mold on my list of surprise guesses so many times. Maybe someday I will have to go back and find all my list of guesses over the years and make note of how many times certain molds have shown up. Anyway, this mold is based on the Frisian breed, which originates in the Netherlands, a country that is not considered Scandinavian, so it does not technically fit the theme breed-wise. When it comes to overall vibes, though, I feel like this mold is really bringing it. I get frolicking through the flowers kind of vibes. I could just see this mold celebrating at a midsummer fair. This mold has additionally been done as a mare, stallion, and gelding in the past, so any of those versions of it could show up. Despite that I'm really catching midsummer vibes from this mold, it does have several problems, which made me put it so far down the list here. First off, it is considered a vintage mold now at 21 years old. And secondly, it hasn't had a larger release since 2020. It did, however, show up in BreyerFest 2024 as a prize model, but there were only 12 of those models made, so that very well might not count. I feel like this mold is rather popular still, but I think like Wixom, it is a case of it just not being as popular as it once was. I really wanted to put this mold up higher on the list because I think it really does just fit so nicely in the terms of BreyerFest vibes, but I think it just unfortunately has too much working against it to make it a stronger pick. The third honorable mention, Show Stance Arabian Mare, aka Zafira. I tried really hard to not let my personal bias for this mold affect me in not including her on this list, because I really am just not a fan of her. But I know there are quite a lot of people that do really like her. She's a mold that seems to be pretty divided in the hobby. It seems like some people either really love her, and then some people are just really not fond of her at all. That could very well put her popularity into question, if Breyer does know that the love for this mold is rather divided, but there could be enough fans of her that they wouldn't be worried about her not selling well. Of course, being an Arabian, she does not really fit the theme of BreyerFest this year, but I can kind of maybe see her fitting the vibe of it. She's something I could potentially see Breyer picking for some reason that I can't quite explain, honestly. Maybe it's the fact that she's a mare. I'm not entirely sure why, but I just kind of have a feeling that we could very well see a mare mold this year. Probably because of the Scandinavian theming with the flowers and floral stuff going on for BreyerFest. That's probably why I keep thinking, maybe it's gonna be a mare. And as you will see later on in this list, I have a lot of molds listed that are either mare molds or have been made as mares before. I just really don't know with Zafira here though. And it is funny because beside her breed and maybe questionable popularity, there's actually nothing else stopping her from being a surprise model, especially since the no standing poses was ruled out in 2024. The fourth honorable mention, the Andalusian mare or Hermosa. I honestly don't have a lot of strong feelings towards this mold being the surprise, and maybe some of my personal bias is getting in the way of that, as I'm not really a fan of this mold either. She's fine, I don't dislike her at all, but she's just not one I have really had any desire to collect beyond maybe having like one or two models on this mold. I kind of feel like she might not be that popular with other hobbyists either. It seems to be a generally liked mold by the hobby, but I feel like I never see a lot of strong love for her. Maybe that's just because she hasn't had many releases the past 5 years. Or maybe she just is one that doesn't wow the hobby like other molds do. The reason I am even considering her though is that I could kind of see her maybe fitting the vibe of BreyerFest this year. I can't really explain why I feel that way, but I could just see her being used and can just imagine Breyer picking her thinking that she fits the vibes. I'm sorry it's a little hard for me to explain just like on vibes alone I'm thinking this mold might work. But as you'll see with this list, it's just kind of come down to that a lot for me. Despite my feeling that she has the vibes for this theme this year, her breed does not actually work with the theme. I don't think she really matches any Scandinavian breed as far as I can find. She is just a very kind of Spanish type horse. Like Wixom and Goffert, she does have a problem when it comes to recent releases. Her last non-one-of-a-kind release was back in 2022, which is a 4-year gap. As of yet, the biggest release gap for the surprise model has been 3 years. That, plus her questionable popularity, is what led me to have her fairly low in the scope of my list here. On to my top 10 list of guesses. Starting off with number 10. Standardbred mare, aka Constantia. Her breed technically doesn't fit the BreyerFest theme, being, well, a standardbred mare, but there are apparently Scandinavian cold-blood trotters. It is important to note that these horses do not have the same body shape as Constantina. She is quite leaner and doesn't have feathering on her feet like they do. But I could potentially see Breyer being like, that's close enough to justify using her as a surprise model. I mean, she is doing the big trotting pose that the trotters do. There is, of course, the issue that she is a sport-type mold, even though she is not directly a warm blood, so not super duper close to being like Totalist last year, but still, she's a sport type as well. I do question this mold's popularity just a little bit. I'd say she's certainly not unpopular, I don't think. I believe she's generally well liked by the hobby. But I also don't feel like she's maybe quite as popular compared to other recent surprise models or other models I'm going to be talking about on this list. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe she is actually quite popular. I know I personally absolutely love her, but sometimes it can just be kind of hard to gauge. Her ability to fit the theme and being a sport type is mostly why I didn't put her up further on this list, but I do really like the idea of her being a surprise enough that I wanted to put her on the list somewhere. Number 9. Cantering Warmblood, aka True North. This mold actually has a lot going for it. It would fit the theme by being a warm blood that could possibly represent a few Scandinavian warm blood breeds. In terms of releases, age, and popularity, it all lines up. I feel like this is a pretty popular mold overall. But it does have the problem that it is, well, a warm blood, and I am just so hesitant by the idea that we'd see yet another warm blood after the Totalis, however you say it, mold was used last year. This mold is at least sculpted by a different artist and is in a rather different pose. It's not doing any kind of dressage pose, it is instead cantering. Furthermore, this mold is often made as a mare, and so with those factors in mind, I did put it in this list and considered it a lot more over a lot of other sport breed molds. But it really is because of that same breed type being represented last year, or even 2 years in a row, depending on how broadly you want to look at it, that I just can't bring myself to put her up any higher on this list. She otherwise would make a very nice surprise model candidate. Number 8. Shire Gelding, aka Shannondale. Now, I know he was just released as a regular run unicorn this year, which should technically eliminate him from the running. But this mold is just otherwise such a nice choice for being the surprise model that I couldn't resist adding him to the list. I do also want to note that him being released as a unicorn instead of a regular horse might make him a little more likely despite the fact that it's a very recent release. If he had been released as a regular run realistic horse, I probably would have bumped him further down this list or even just had him off the list completely. But the fact he came out as a fantasy model makes me think that it's not impossible that he could be the surprise this year. Him also being such a popular model, I think, could maybe negate that a little bit too. One point against him, however, is that he does look maybe a little too similar to Othello in overall body position and draft type. Obviously, they are two completely different models, but I mean in the sense that maybe he doesn't feel diverse enough in the existing lineup of special run models with Othello to also be there. Aside from that and the regular run release, he doesn't break any other patterns. He is a very popular mold, as mentioned. He has a mane and tail variation that could be fun to see utilized. But most importantly, he's a mold that actually could work well for the Scandinavian theme. As this drafty type mold, he could probably pass for several Scandinavian breeds, such as the Norse-Swedish horse, for example. He really could just work so nicely for the theme, and I would have put him higher up on this list, but him maybe looking a little too similar to Othello is what made me decide to put him much lower down it. Although it is to note that when it's the braided mane and tail version, it looks a little bit less like Othello. So maybe if they leaned into that more, I could see it definitely being a little bit different enough from Othello. Number 7. Trotting Arabian Mare, aka Weather Girl. Part of me really wanted to put this girl higher up on the list, but the reason I put her down here is because of the fact that she was a treasure hunt model in 2011, and I still can't help but wonder that a model that was used for a treasure hunt or other big gambler's choice run, like the Christmas gamblers models, might be something that Breyer doesn't consider as much for being surprise models, since they already got a release where they came in 4+ different colors. With that treasure hunt event being 15 years old now, though, perhaps it's been long enough that she could just have another big gambler's choice release again. But on the other hand, that also means that this mold is 15 years old, which definitely does not rule it out yet for being considered, since there have been 2 15-year-old molds used for the surprise before, but it is to note that she is getting on the older side. Her last release was in 2024, which is still within range of the patterns. I'd say she's a pretty popular mold with a lot of fans. Being a very Arabian-typey model, this mold is definitely not fitting into the category of Scandinavian breeds, but I think she does bring the midsummer vibes. I can see her trotting through the flowers, wearing a flower crown, just having a good time with the midsummer fair. Number 6. Morgan Stallion, aka Troubadour. Now, I know what you're thinking, but this mold is being used as a Best Customs Contest prize model this year. I know, but hear me out. The surprise model last year also had a model on the same mold as a glossy prize model, which I know is just a glossed regular run for the open show, but still, I feel like it's not impossible, especially since there are so few of the Best Customs Contest prize models made, which are even less than the glossy prize models. I know what you might also be thinking, but he's sculpted to be a Morgan, and that's not a Scandinavian breed, so he doesn't even fit the theme, so why consider him? And I know he doesn't, but again, hear me out here. I could almost see Breyer interpreting him as another breed for the festival, such as the Finn horse. The Finn horse is apparently classified as a cold-blood breed. It's obviously not going to have the same conformation as a Morgan, but from the photos of Finn horses I have gleaned online, some of them kind of almost look like they could be Morgans in how they are built. Just kind of a vague representation where I feel like, that kind of almost looks like a Morgan. So, I don't know, he could maybe work. Is having Troubadour on this list kind of a stretch? Maybe, I don't know, especially because of him being the prize model and all. But he does just look like he'd make a super nice surprise model. I even feel like he fits the theme in terms of just overall vibes, even if his breed does not match the theme. I really don't know how to explain it, but I just think he's a nice choice. I feel like he's a very popular mold, and the kind of mold that I feel like Breyer would maybe pick for being the surprise model, even for a Scandinavian event. Number 5. Shaga Arabian, aka Yasmin. This mold honestly does not feel super midsummer vibes for me. She does a little bit though, and she does in a way that I could see Breyer picking her, which is why she is where she is on this list. Along with the fact that she doesn't hard break any patterns. She does break a couple soft patterns though, aside from the whole breed not fitting the theme thing, which are that she is sculpted by the same sculptor as last year's surprise model, which I know some other molds I talked about already have as well, and I just didn't end up mentioning it. But another kind of weird one is that she hasn't been in the BreyerFest live auction since 2017, or 2019 if you count non-one-of-a-kind models. I don't strongly take this pattern into account though. I have noticed that every previous surprise model has had a live auction model of it made within 5 years of it becoming the surprise, which I don't think is intentional at all, but more a sign of what Breyer thinks will be popular sellers at the auction. I don't feel like this mold is really unpopular at all, though. Maybe not super popular, but not one I'd say is disliked at all. So I don't really think this auction sort of pattern thing is really any sign of an effect on her chances. I just thought I'd mention it though, since it did show up on my spreadsheet of patterns. I have mixed feelings on this mold for the surprise and wanted to put her a little further down the list because I think so many other molds would just make better or more fitting surprise models for this year. But for some reason, I really could just see Breyer picking her, thus why I put her at this spot. Number 4. Bluegrass Bandit. Originally sculpted to be a Tennessee walking horse, which definitely doesn't fit the BreyerFest theme this year, but on vibes alone, I feel like this mold would be a very nice choice. Personally, I see this mold as one that's just so pretty, especially in her face and her mane, just kind of like pretty and elegant. She feels like a perfect flower crown wearing girl. I'm also a little biased because I really like this mold. But yeah, I don't know, she's really giving me the midsummer vibes. Aside from her breed not being Scandinavian, she does unfortunately have some other problems, mainly that she is now an 18-year-old mold, which is not too far off from the 16 years old that they've used before, so I could still see her being possible. And a possibly less important factor, but one I want to note, is like Yasmin, she hasn't been used as a live auction model since 2020. Again, not really taking that far into consideration though, especially since she has had a couple recent releases, that of a flagship model last year and the volunteer model a year prior. I know the volunteer model coming in 3 colors might put her use of being a surprise model into question, but since they were all the same pattern with just different shades of chestnut, I feel like that's different enough from the big Gambler's Choice releases like the surprise that it would maybe be okay. It's just so hard to say, I don't know. But her being a flagship model recently really is one of the reasons I'm like, yeah, I could kind of see them using her again since they have had her very recently in production. And as for popularity, I do feel like her popularity might not be as big as it has in the past, but I think she is still pretty overall well-liked in the hobby. I don't know why, but I think she would just make such a good surprise model for this theme. And my bias towards that is probably why she is where she is on this list. Number 3. The Lipizzaner Mare, aka Karina. This is another mold where the original breed type doesn't really fit the BreyerFest theme this year, but I feel like her overall presence could work. She's got a pose that feels like she could be dancing and celebrating a little. I don't get like super strong midsummer vibes from her, but kind of like Yasmin, it does feel like something I could see Breyer picking to be the surprise model. I do feel like this is a mold that's not exactly super popular. It's one of those ones where I think the hobby does generally like it overall, but I don't see a ton of hype around her. Then again, she hasn't had many releases in the past few years, so maybe that's why I feel like I haven't seen a whole lot of love for her. Her age and recent releases are all within the surprise patterns. I will note that she was sculpted by the same sculptor as Totalis, so in that regard, she does feel a little similar to him, but I think her breed and pose is different enough that it would still make her eligible to be the surprise. I will admit I do have some personal bias against this mold in that it's kind of like the Andalusian mare for me. I like it alright, but I don't really have the desire to collect many models on it. I tried really hard not to let that affect my ranking of her though, because it does just feel like one of those molds that I could easily see Breyer deciding to use for some reason. And in regards to her kind of questionable popularity, it does seem like with the surprise models sometimes that it kind of alternates between like being a super popular mold and then a kind of not as popular mold but still a little popular. And I feel like she would kind of fit into that category. A mold that is well liked but not crazy popular. Number 2. Working Cow Horse, aka Bobby Joe. Does this breed fit the BreyerFest theme? Technically not at all. I don't think they are very big on reining or cattle working stock horses in Scandinavia, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. While her breed doesn't fit, I can't help but picture this mold spinning around a maypole with a flower crown on her head. She's just having a good time dancing at the summer celebrations. Maybe a strange choice with her stocky build, but she otherwise fits the typical BreyerFest patterns. She was a regular run Halloween release last year. She now is 11 years old, but that is definitely still young enough to be the surprise, and she seems to be a generally well-liked mold amongst the hobby. Although I do feel like her overall popularity has perhaps waned a little bit in recent years, she's popular but not to a raving degree, which is okay. I know she might seem like a strange choice for the number 2 spot on this list, but with her only downside being that she's a stock horse breed, I otherwise feel like she's something Breyer would easily pick to be a surprise model. And finally, my number 1 guess for the surprise model, Frisian Sport Horse, aka Vermeer, or also the Walking Frisian. Now I have actually been seeing a lot of guesses for this mold, despite the fact that, again, the Frisian breed doesn't originate in one of the Scandinavian countries, it instead originates in the Netherlands. It is possible that this mold is being interpreted as a different breed or cross, or it could just be picked on midsummer vibes alone. I think just on vibes is possibly the reason that this mold has been more highly guessed, unless people are just assuming it's maybe a Scandinavian breed. It is another mold that I just feel like could fit different themes and vibes for BreyerFest this year. Aside from just midsummer walking through the flowers with a flower crown and all that, I could also see him being a nice kind of like Viking horse. Kind of like the Othello special run, which is very like Viking looking. But this guy is, I think, different enough that he doesn't look too much like Othello. Maybe a kind of weird connection, and some of this also applies to Goffert, by the way, and I just forgot to mention it. But the Frisian breed and Frisian Sport Horse are very popular breeds in the Star Stable game, which is a company based in Sweden. I feel like I myself remember back in the day writing my G1 Frisian around the Midsummer Festivals back when Star Stable had that. So I feel like maybe that's another reason why people just immediately think that maybe Vermeer would be a really great fit for the surprise, because I feel like there's been some connections in not just the model horse hobby, but like also horse video games of the Frisian and Scandinavian countries. And aside from the specific breed of this mold maybe being a little questionable for the theme, there is otherwise nothing that would make this mold unlikely for being a surprise model. He had a Collector Club release last year, so recent, but not too recent. He is a pretty young mold at 6 years old, and generally very popular, I feel like. While pretty much all the other molds on this list, I have shuffled around their places a lot while making this video to try and get an order that I think feels best. This guy has always remained at the number 1 spot for me for what I think will be most likely. So I think that confirms without a doubt that he is my top guess for the Scandi surprise. Here is my final list of all the guesses laid out on screen. This was a tough year for mold guesses for sure. I'm sure, like always, I'll want to rearrange this list every time I look at it, but at least I feel like probably one of these molds will likely end up being the surprise, I hope. If Breyer comes out with a bunch of models that drastically affect this list before BreyerFest, I will post a short updated list here on YouTube and on my other social media that may or may not be a video or just like an image post. But that's only if the list drastically changes. If it only changes by like eliminating 1 or 2 molds, then I probably won't post an updated list. Now let's go into talking about color speculation before I start wrapping up this video. As far as the colors I'm guessing for the surprise model, this is always a really hard part in trying to predict. The only thing I can say for almost certainty is that we usually see at least 1 solid colored model and at least 1 pinto patterned model. We do also often see a decorator and sometimes an Appaloosa. I do wonder if we will see an Appaloosa this year. It seems to lately have been like every other year for the past 4 years, so maybe we'll get an Appaloosa one this year. We also usually see a mix of matte and glossy variations. Usually, most of the matte variations get a glossy variation, but there's sometimes cases where there's 1 model that's only in matte and 1 model that is only in gloss. In the past 4 years, we've seen the surprise have 6 different color variations, and then 10 or 12 variations in total when we count both matte and glossy variations, and that is a lot of possibility for different colors. I honestly don't really have any thoughts in guessing the specific realistic color variations I think we'll see this year, so instead I'm just going to focus on speculating about the potential decorator model. As I mentioned, decorator model in the surprise is not a guarantee, but we have had one ever since 2021, so it is probably very likely that we'll have one again this year. The decorator model is sometimes tied to the theme of BreyerFest that year in a pretty obvious way, but it is often kind of not as obvious, or it is just kind of not really tied to the theme at all and just a pretty decorator. So it is very possible that the decorator might just be something random that's not super tied to the theme, but it is possible it could be tied to the theme, and so I have some thoughts on it I want to share. My first thought is that maybe the decorator could have some floral inspiration behind it. Perhaps something as obvious as having flower designs on the model, or perhaps something more subtle like a decorator in bright or pastel flower colors. Kind of like this past special run, for example. I'd love to see a similar color idea brought back again. Later editing, Stormy adding in here, I wrote and recorded this part of the video before the Deco Letha variation was revealed. This deco is actually kind of what I was thinking the surprise deco might look like, but of course now that we see him, I'm guessing the decorator model for the surprise, if they do one, won't look very similar to this. I mean, maybe it still will, but I'd imagine they'd do something kind of different and not too close to this. So yeah, I just wanted to add that in since this has been surprisingly revealed, and I will resume now to what I had already pre-recorded. Another thought I have is something that is tied to Scandinavia more directly, or maybe indirectly, like a Copenhagen-colored decorator to nod to the city of Copenhagen, but I know they already have a model that is named that this year, so I don't know if they'd go that route. Maybe they do something inspired by the nature or landscape of Scandinavia, like something with pretty blues and greens. I would almost suggest something inspired by the Northern Lights, but we just got Northern Light inspired models for the Christmas surprise, so I'm not sure if we'd get that again so soon. Something that could be fun is if it is inspired by mythology. The special run decorator is inspired by Norse mythology, and there are some BreyerFest workshops this year that are also inspired by mythology. There is one workshop that is specifically inspired by runestones, so I can't help but think how cool would it be to have a runestone-inspired model. I did also wonder if maybe we could see a unicorn, but I'm actually not sure if those are really a part of Scandinavian folklore and mythology. I tried to do some research into it, but I couldn't really find anything definitive, so I don't know if unicorns have any strong ties to Scandinavian culture. If you happen to know anything about that, you are welcome to let me know in the comments about it, because I genuinely don't know, and I could not find a good source for it. The possibilities are just truly endless on what the surprise decorator variation could look like, but I think it's just a fun thing to think about and speculate, and see if maybe one of your guesses does get close to what it might actually look like. You can let me know in the comments if you happen to have any ideas on what you think the decorator would look like, or just surprise colors in general. Like always, I am so excited to see what the BreyerFest surprise model is going to be this year when it gets revealed at BreyerFest. Hopefully it actually gets revealed at BreyerFest and not beforehand. This thing of Breyer revealing the special run variation splits is so crazy since it's not really ever been done before, and I've been worried the whole time making this video now that they are going to reveal like a hint or something to end up making half my video here get completely changed or something. Hopefully that doesn't happen like as soon as I'm posting this video. But regardless, I'm very excited to find out what the surprise is at BreyerFest, and just so excited to go to BreyerFest this year in general. Yes, if you haven't already heard, I will be at BreyerFest this year. I am hoping that by the end of June, I will have another video, or at least a post out, talking about all the details I want to share regarding that. But I do have a couple things I want to share right now, though. First is that I will be at the BreyerFest social media meet, and that takes place at the Clarion Hotel on July 11th at 8 p.m. Like usual, they will have a raffle where the benefits of it go to the Old Friends Thoroughbred Retirement Farm. It is always a blast, and right now that is the only place and time that I can guarantee I will be at this year, since I will not be selling out of a Clarion room or at the BreyerFest swap meet. The other thing I want to mention, because I completely forgot to mention it in the last video talking about the BreyerFest models, is that I do plan to vlog my BreyerFest experience this year. I may end up mostly vlogging with my phone, so it may not be like the most amazing quality compared to some other years where I've vlogged with my fancier filming camera, but I really want to vlog this year, especially with my fiance going along with me for the first time, and so I really want to make sure I capture some of his reactions. And so I plan to edit and post whatever vlogging shenanigans end up happening sometime after BreyerFest. So look out for that video. It might not come out until like late July or sometime in August, but it'll come out at some point. Now it is time for me to officially wrap up this video. As always, feel free to let me know what you think the surprise model will be in the comments. I love hearing what everyone else thinks and seeing how people's guesses align or differ. And of course, seeing later who ends up guessing correctly when we find out what the surprise model is. Don't forget to leave a like to help support the channel and videos like these. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an awesome day and an awesome BreyerFest, whether you plan to go in person or celebrating virtually. Bye everyone!